Tonight, the open road becomes a corridor for chilling encounters as we explore 10 of the most disturbing true ghost stories that have unfolded during road trips across America. These harrowing accounts were sent in by ordinary travelers, people who set out with only a full tank and a sense of adventure, only to find themselves facing the inexplicable, the ghostly, and in some cases the deeply haunted sites that line our country's highways. Each story is grounded in real people's experiences drawn from verified submissions and first-hand reports, and they stand as proof that even the most familiar roads can hide secrets the living cannot explain. If you are passionate about true horror and the mysteries lurking just beyond the headlights, be sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for daily stories that will keep you thinking long after the engine cools. Click the notification bell so you never miss a journey into the unknown. Buckle up. Tonight we are following the ghostly legends that haunt America's highways. My name is Jessica, and I am 24 years old. I work as a graphic designer in Portland, and I have always considered myself a pretty rational person. I do not believe in ghost or supernatural nonsense, and I have never been the type to get spooked by urban legends or creepy stories. That all changed during what should have been a simple road trip down Highway 101 to visit my college friend Emma in San Francisco. What happened on that rain-soaked October night still makes me question everything I thought I knew about the world. I had been planning this trip for months. Emma had just gotten a new apartment in the Mission District, and she wanted me to come see it. The drive from Portland to San Francisco along the coast is absolutely beautiful during good weather, but I should have checked the forecast more carefully. By the time I left Portland around 4 p.m. on a Friday, the skies were already looking threatening. I figured I could make it to at least halfway before the worst of the storm hit, maybe find a decent motel somewhere around the Oregon-California border. The first few hours went smoothly enough. Traffic was light heading out of the city, and I made good time through Salem and Eugene. I had my playlist going, a thermos of coffee in the cup holder, and I was actually enjoying the solitude of the open road. The Pacific Coast Highway has always been one of my favorite drives, with those dramatic cliffs and endless ocean views. But as evening approached, and I got deeper into the coastal mountains, the weather started turning ugly. The rain began as a light drizzle around 7 p.m., just as I was passing through some tiny logging town, whose name I cannot even remember now. Within an hour, it had turned into a full-blown downpour, the kind of rain that makes your windshield wipers completely useless and forces you to slow down to about 30 miles per hour just to see the road ahead. I started getting nervous about driving in these conditions, especially on the winding mountain roads with all those steep drop-offs down to the ocean. By 9 p.m., I was seriously considering pulling over and waiting out the storm, but every time I saw what looked like it might be a safe place to stop, it turned out to be just a narrow shoulder or a blocked-off scenic viewpoint. The rain was coming down so hard that it sounded like someone was dumping buckets of water on my roof. My headlights were barely cutting through the darkness and the fog that had started rolling in from the ocean. I had the radio turned up trying to get a weather report, but all I was getting was static. That is when I saw her. She was standing maybe 50 feet ahead on the right side of the road, just at the edge of where my headlights could reach. Even through the rain and darkness, I could make out the figure of an elderly woman in what looked like a long white dress or nightgown. She was not moving, not waving for help, just standing there, completely still in the pouring rain. My first thought was that she must be in some kind of trouble. Maybe her car had broken down, or she had wandered away from a nursing home or something. You do not just stand on the side of a mountain highway in the middle of a storm unless something is seriously wrong. I slowed down and pulled over as close as I could get to where she was standing. I rolled down my passenger window and called out to her, asking if she needed help. She did not respond at first, but then she started walking toward my car. As she got closer, I could see that she was probably in her 70s, with long gray hair that was completely soaked and plastered to her head. Her dress looked old-fashioned, like something from maybe the 1950s or 1960s, and it was definitely not appropriate clothing for this kind of weather. When she reached my car, she leaned down to the window and looked directly at me. Her eyes were the palest blue I have ever seen, almost colorless, and there was something about her expression that made me feel deeply uncomfortable. She did not look confused or grateful for the help like I would have expected. She looked almost sad, but also very serious, like she was carrying some kind of heavy burden. Without any greeting or explanation, she said in a voice that was barely above a whisper, "You need to be very careful about the bridge ahead. The bridge is not safe tonight." Then she opened my passenger door and got into the car before I could say anything to stop her. I was so surprised by her sudden movement that I just sat there for a moment, not sure what to do. She settled into the passenger seat and buckled her seatbelt, still dripping wet from the rain. The inside of my car immediately started smelling like wet wool and something else that I could not quite identify, something musty and old. I asked her where she needed to go, and she just pointed ahead down the highway and said, "Just drive. I will tell you when to stop." As I pulled back onto the road, I tried to make conversation. I asked her what had happened to her car where she lived, if there was someone I could call to let them know she was safe. But she did not really answer any of my questions directly. She just kept staring straight ahead through the windshield and occasionally murmuring things about being careful, about watching out for the bridge. I started thinking that maybe she had some kind of dementia or other mental health issue that was making her confused. We drove in mostly silence for about 20 minutes. The rain was still coming down hard, and the road was getting more treacherous with every mile. I had to concentrate completely on staying in my lane and not hydroplaning on the curves. Then, as we came around a particularly sharp bend, I saw it ahead of us. There was an old concrete bridge spanning what looked like a deep ravine. It was not a very long bridge, maybe 200 feet, but it looked narrow and the guardrails seemed low and flimsy. As soon as the bridge came into view, the woman in my passenger seat became agitated. She started gripping the door handle and repeating, "Not safe, not safe. The bridge is not safe tonight." I slowed down even more as we approached the bridge, and that is when I saw the problem. The storm had washed out a huge section of the road surface on the far side of the bridge. If I had been driving at normal speed in this weather, I probably would not have seen it until it was too late. I would have crossed the bridge and then driven straight into what was basically a 20-foot deep crater where the road used to be. I hit the brakes and came to a complete stop just before the bridge entrance. My heart was pounding as I realized how close I had come to what could have been a fatal accident. I turned to thank the woman for warning me, to tell her that she had probably saved my life. But when I looked at the passenger seat, it was empty. The woman was gone, completely gone. The seatbelt was still buckled as if someone had been sitting there, but there was no sign of her. The seat was not even wet anymore, even though she had been absolutely soaking when she got into my car. I immediately checked the back seat, thinking maybe she had somehow moved back there, but the car was empty. I got out and looked around outside, calling for her, but there was no trace of anyone in the rain and darkness. I stood there in the storm for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened. The doors had been locked while we were driving. I'm absolutely certain of that because I always lock my doors when I am driving alone at night. There was no way she could have gotten out of the car without me noticing, especially while we were moving. But she was gone, as if she had never been there at all. I eventually got back in my car and carefully turned around to head back the way I had come. I drove about 30 miles back to the last town I had passed through and found a motel for the night. I barely slept, going over and over what had happened, trying to come up with some rational explanation. Maybe I had been more tired than I realized. Maybe the stress of driving in the storm had made me hallucinate. Maybe there had never been anyone in my car at all. The next morning, after the storm had passed, I drove back to the bridge. In daylight, I could see that the washout was even worse than I'd realized the night before. The entire road surface had collapsed into the ravine below. If I had driven into that hole at highway speed, I definitely would have been killed. There were already work crews out there putting up barriers and detour signs. I talked to one of the road crew supervisors and asked him about the woman I had seen the night before. I described her and asked if anyone had reported a missing elderly person in the area. He looked at me strangely and said that no one lived anywhere near that stretch of highway. The nearest house was probably 10 miles away, and there had been no reports of anyone missing. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. He told me that about 20 years ago, there had been a fatal accident at that exact spot. An elderly woman named Margaret Sullivan had been driving home from her daughter's house during a winter storm. Her car had skidded on the wet road and crashed through the guardrail, falling into the ravine below. She had died instantly. The supervisor said that over the years, there had been several reports from drivers who claimed to have seen an elderly woman in a white dress standing near the bridge, especially during bad weather. When I got home, I could not stop thinking about what he had told me, so I decided to do some research online. I found the newspaper archives from the local paper and looked up Margaret Sullivan's accident. There was her obituary, with a photograph that made me nearly drop my laptop. It was her. The same pale blue eyes, the same long gray hair, the same serious expression that I had seen in my passenger seat. The woman who had saved my life had been dead for 20 years. I've driven that stretch of Highway 101 several times since then, but always during daylight and good weather. I have never seen her again, but I have left flowers at the spot where I first saw her standing in the rain. I do not know why she appeared to me that night, or how she knew about the danger ahead, but I'm certain that Margaret Sullivan saved my life. Sometimes I wonder how many other drivers she has warned over the years, and whether they believed what they saw, or convinced themselves it was just their imagination. I am not the same person I was before that night. I do not dismiss ghost stories anymore, and I pay attention when people tell me about unexplained experiences they have had, because I know now that there are things in this world that cannot be explained by logic or science. Sometimes the dead do return, and sometimes they return to help the living. Margaret Sullivan proved that to me on a dark, rain-soaked highway 20 years after her own death, and I will never forget her kindness or her warning about the bridge that was not safe that night. My name is David, and I am 31 years old. I work construction in Denver, and I have been doing this job for almost 10 years now. The work takes me all over Colorado and sometimes into neighboring states, which means I spend a lot of time driving on remote highways and back roads. I thought I knew every gas station, truck stop, and roadside diner between Denver and the state borders. That confidence got shattered on a cold March night when I encountered something that still makes me question my own sanity. I had gotten a call about an emergency job down in Alamosa. A warehouse had suffered some structural damage during a late winter storm, and they needed someone to assess the situation before the building inspector arrived on Monday morning. The pay was good enough that I did not mind driving down there on a Sunday night, even though it meant getting to the job site around midnight and working through the night. I loaded my truck with tools and equipment and hit the road around 8 p.m., planning to take Highway 285 south through the mountains. The drive started out normally enough. Traffic was light since most people do not travel mountain highways on Sunday nights in March. The weather was clear but cold, probably around 20 degrees, and there was still snow on the ground from the storm that had hit the previous week. I had made this drive dozens of times before, so I knew exactly where the gas stations were and how to pace myself to avoid running low on fuel in the middle of nowhere. About 2 hours into the drive, somewhere between Fairplay and Poncha Springs, I noticed that my fuel gauge was sitting lower than I had expected. I thought I had filled up before leaving Denver, but apparently I had only topped off the tank instead of getting a complete fill. The needle was just below the quarter tank mark, and I knew from experience that my truck gets terrible mileage when it is loaded down with tools and equipment. I started watching for gas stations, but This stretch of highway is pretty desolate, especially late at night. I drove for another 30 miles without seeing any open stations. A couple of small towns had gas pumps, but they were the kind of mom and pop operations that close at 6 p.m. and do not reopen until morning. My fuel gauge was now sitting just above the red line, and I was starting to get genuinely worried about being stranded out there in the cold. Cell phone coverage in that area is spotty at best, and I did not relish the idea of walking 10 miles to find help. That is when I saw the glow up ahead on the right side of the highway. It was clearly a gas station with bright lights illuminating the pumps and what looked like a small convenience store or garage. I felt a huge wave of relief as I pulled off the highway and into the station. As I got closer, I noticed that the whole place had a distinctly vintage feel to it. The pumps looked like they were from the 1950s, the kind with the round glass tops and analog dials instead of digital displays. The main building was a small white structure with large windows and a red and blue neon sign that said Jim's Service Station in old-fashioned script lettering. I pulled up to the nearest pump and got out of my truck. The cold air hit me immediately, and I noticed that the station was completely silent except for the low hum of the overhead lights. There were no other customers, which was not surprising given the late hour and remote location. I tried to figure out how to operate the antique-looking pump, but there was no card reader or digital interface anywhere to be found. Just as I was starting to wonder if the pumps even worked, the door to the main building opened and a man walked out. He was probably in his 60s, wearing dark blue coveralls with Jim embroidered on the chest pocket. He had gray hair and a friendly smile, and he moved with the confident ease of someone who had been running a gas station for decades. He approached my truck and asked what I needed, and I told him I wanted to fill up the tank. He nodded and said that would be no problem, but that I would need to pay inside since the pumps did not take credit cards. I followed him into the building, which was even more of a time capsule than the exterior had suggested. The interior looked exactly like something from the 1950s, with black and white checkered floor tiles, a red Coca-Cola cooler, and displays of motor oil and automotive supplies that I had not seen in modern stores for years. Everything was clean and well maintained, but it all had that unmistakable vintage look that you usually only see in museums or restored diners. Jim told me that a full tank would run about $45, which seemed reasonable enough. I pulled out my wallet to pay with cash, since he had mentioned that they did not take credit cards. As I handed him the money, I asked how long he had been running the station. He smiled and said that it had been in his family for more than 30 years, and that he had taken over the business from his father. He seemed like a genuinely nice guy, the kind of small-town business owner who takes pride in providing good service to travelers passing through. While Jim went outside to pump my gas, I looked around the store a bit more. There were racks of snacks and drinks, but again, everything looked like it was from a different era. The candy bars were brands I remembered from my childhood, and the soda bottles were the old-fashioned glass ones instead of plastic. Even the magazines on the rack looked like they were from several decades ago. It was charming in a nostalgic way, but also slightly unsettling. It felt like I had driven into some kind of time warp. Jim finished filling my tank and came back inside to give me my receipt. He asked where I was headed, and I told him about the job in Alamosa. He nodded and said I should be careful driving through the mountains at night, especially with the possibility of black ice on the road. I thanked him for the warning and for staying open so late. He just smiled and said that he was always happy to help travelers who found themselves in need of fuel or assistance. I got back in my truck and continued south toward Alamosa. The rest of the drive went smoothly, and I arrived at the job site right on schedule. I spent the night assessing the warehouse damage and preparing a report for the building inspector. It was not until the next morning, as I was driving back to Denver, that I decided to stop at Jim's Service Station again. I wanted to grab some coffee for the road, and I figured it would be nice to see the place in daylight. I knew exactly where the station was located, so I started watching for it as I approached the area where I had stopped the night before. But as I drove past the spot where I was certain the station had been, there was nothing there. Just an empty lot with some concrete foundations and the remains of what might once have been a small building. I thought maybe I had miscalculated the distance, so I drove a few more miles in each direction, but there was definitely no gas station anywhere in that area. Confused and more than a little disturbed, I pulled over at the next exit and drove into a small town called Villa Grove. I found a local diner and asked the waitress about gas stations along that stretch of highway. She told me that the nearest station was about 20 miles in either direction, and that there had not been a gas station in that particular area for many years. When I described Jim's service station to her, she got a strange look on her face. She said that there used to be a station there, but it had burned down in 1962. The owner, a man named Jim Patterson, had died in the fire along with his wife. She said that over the years, a few travelers had reported seeing lights and activity at that location late at night, but most people assumed it was just tricks of the light or fatigue-induced hallucinations. When I told her that I had actually stopped there and bought gas, she looked at me like I was either lying or completely crazy. I drove back to the location one more time to make absolutely sure I had not made a mistake. The empty lot was still there, with those concrete foundations that could have been the remains of a gas station. But there was definitely no building, no pumps, and no sign that there had been any recent activity in the area. The whole place was overgrown with weeds and clearly abandoned. The really unsettling part came when I got back to Denver and looked at my receipt from the night before. I had stuffed it into my wallet without really paying attention to it, but when I pulled it out, it was clearly printed on old-fashioned receipt paper with a manual cash register. The date on the receipt was from the night I had stopped there, but everything else about it looked like it was from decades ago. The receipt is sitting in my desk drawer right now, and I look at it sometimes when I need to remind myself that what happened that night was real. I've driven that stretch of Highway 285 many times since then, always during daylight hours, and I've never seen any trace of Jim's service station again. But I know what I experienced that night. I know that I stopped at a gas station that should not have existed, bought fuel from a man who died more than 60 years ago, and somehow made it safely to my destination. I do not understand how it happened or why, but I'm grateful that Jim Patterson was there when I needed help, even though he has been dead for longer than I have been alive. My name is Emma, and I am 28 years old. I work as a third-grade teacher in Atlanta, and up until 2 years ago, I thought I had a pretty good handle on what was real and what was not. I have always been the practical one among my friends, the person who rolls her eyes at ghost stories and finds logical explanations for things that seem spooky. That all changed during what should have been a routine cross-country move with my boyfriend Marcus when we encountered something on Interstate 75 that still gives me chills every time I think about it. Marcus had gotten a job offer in Seattle that was too good to pass up, so we decided to make the move together. We loaded all our belongings into a U-Haul truck and planned to drive straight through, taking turns behind the wheel so we could make the trip in about 3 days. I was excited about the adventure and the chance to see parts of the country I had never visited before. We left Atlanta on a Thursday morning with high spirits and a carefully planned route that would take us through Tennessee, Kentucky, Illinois, and then west through the Plain States. The first day went perfectly. We made good time through Tennessee and stopped for the night in Louisville. The second day was more challenging because we hit some construction delays in Illinois, but we still managed to cover a lot of ground. By the time we reached the Missouri border, we were both feeling confident about our schedule and eager to keep pushing forward. Marcus suggested that we drive through the night to make up some of the time we had lost during the day, and I agreed. We had been taking turns every 4 hours, so we were both still feeling pretty fresh. I took over driving around 10 p.m. somewhere outside of Springfield. Marcus curled up in the passenger seat with a pillow and was asleep within minutes. The highway was mostly empty, except for the occasional semi-truck, and I settled into a comfortable rhythm. The radio was playing softly, and I had a thermos of coffee to keep me alert. For the first couple of hours, everything was routine. I passed through several small towns, saw the usual mix of gas stations and fast food restaurants, and made steady progress toward our next planned stop in Kansas City. It was around 1 a.m. when I first noticed the car on the side of the road. At first, it just looked like another breakdown situation, the kind of thing you see all the time on long highway trips. There was an older sedan, maybe from the 1980s, pulled over on the shoulder with its hazard lights flashing. As I got closer, I could see 4 people standing next to the car. There was a man and a woman who looked like they were probably in their 30s, and 2 children who appeared to be maybe 8 and 10 years old. They were all dressed in what looked like their Sunday best, the kind of formal clothing that people used to wear for special occasions or travel. My first instinct was to keep driving. Marcus and I had discussed this before we left Atlanta. We agreed that we would not stop to help stranded motorists because it could be dangerous, especially when we were traveling with all our belongings in the back of the truck. But something about this particular situation bothered me. The family looked genuinely distressed, and it was a cold night in the middle of nowhere. The children appeared to be shivering, and the woman was holding the younger child close to her body as if she was trying to keep them warm. I slowed down and pulled over about 50 feet ahead of their car. I figured I could at least call 911 for them and maybe offer to contact a tow truck or taxi service. Marcus woke up when he felt the truck slowing down, and I explained what I had seen. He was not thrilled about stopping, but he agreed that we should at least check if they needed emergency assistance. We both got out of the truck and walked back toward the family. As we approached, I got a better look at them, and something immediately struck me as odd. They were all standing perfectly still, not moving around or trying to stay warm despite the cold temperature. The man was tall and thin with dark hair that was slicked back in an old-fashioned style. The woman had blonde hair that was styled in a way that reminded me of photographs from the 1950s. The children, a boy and a girl, were both dressed in what looked like vintage clothing that you might see in an old family portrait. When we got within about 10 feet of them, I called out and asked if they needed help. All 4 of them turned to look at us simultaneously, which was the first thing that really creeped me out. Their movement was perfectly synchronized, as if they were all connected somehow. The man opened his mouth as if he was going to speak, but no sound came out. The woman did the same thing. They looked like they were trying to communicate with us, but they could not produce any voices. Marcus stepped closer and asked if their car had broken down. Again, the man tried to speak, but there was only silence. The children moved closer to their parents, and I noticed that all 4 of them had the same expression on their faces. They looked sad and confused, but also hopeful, as if they were desperately hoping that we could help them with something. The woman pointed toward their car and then back toward the highway, but I could not understand what she was trying to tell us. I walked over to examine their car more closely. It was an old Buick sedan, probably from the early 1980s, but it was in remarkably good condition for its age. The paint was faded but not rusted, and the interior looked clean and well-maintained. I tried to open the hood to see if I could identify an obvious mechanical problem, but it was locked. When I looked back at the family, they were all staring at me with those same sad, hopeful expressions. Marcus suggested that we call 911 and report the stranded family. But when I pulled out my cell phone, I discovered that I had no signal. That was not unusual for rural stretches of highway, but it meant that we could not immediately contact emergency services. I told the family that we would drive to the next town and send help back for them. The man nodded as if he understood, but the woman shook her head frantically and pointed again toward their car. That is when things got really strange. I decided to walk around to the other side of their car to see if there was any obvious damage or mechanical problem that might explain why they were stranded. but as I rounded the rear of the vehicle, I stopped dead in my tracks. The entire back end of the car was completely smashed. The rear window was shattered, the trunk was crushed almost flat, and the back bumper was twisted and hanging at an odd angle. It looked like the car had been in a severe rear-end collision. I called Marcus over to look at the damage, and his reaction was the same as mine. How were these people standing around calmly when their car had obviously been in a major accident? Where were the other vehicles involved in the crash? Why was there no debris on the highway? And most importantly, how were none of them showing any signs of injury despite the massive damage to their car? We both turned back to look at the family, but they were gone. All four of them had simply vanished. The car was still there with its hazard lights flashing, but there was no sign of the people who had been standing beside it just moments before. Marcus and I looked around frantically, calling out to them, but there was no response. They had disappeared completely, as if they had never been there at all. We walked back to our truck in silence, both of us trying to process what we had just witnessed. As we got back on the highway, I kept checking my mirrors to see if the family had returned to their car, but the vehicle just sat there empty on the shoulder. We drove in uncomfortable silence for about 20 miles before either of us spoke. Finally, Marcus said what we were both thinking. There was something very wrong with what we had just experienced. When we reached the next town, we stopped at a 24-hour gas station and asked the clerk if there had been any reports of accidents or stranded motorists on the highway that night. He said he had not heard anything, but he gave us the number for the local sheriff's department. When I called and described what we had seen, the dispatcher seemed genuinely puzzled. She said there had been no accident reports in that area and no calls about stranded motorists. The next morning, when we reached Kansas City, I decided to do some research about that stretch of highway. I went online and searched for information about accidents and incidents on Interstate 75 in that area. What I found made my blood run cold. In 1983, almost exactly 40 years before our encounter, a family of 4 had been killed in a rear-end collision at mile marker 247. A drunk driver in a semi-truck had slammed into the back of their car at high speed, killing all 4 occupants instantly. The family consisted of Robert and Linda Mitchell and their 2 children, Tommy and Susan. The newspaper article included a photograph of the family taken just before their fatal trip. It was them, the same man with the slicked back hair, the same woman with the 1950s hairstyle, and the same 2 children in their formal clothing. They had been traveling to a wedding in St. Louis when the accident occurred. According to the article, the family had been driving a 1982 Buick sedan, the same type of car we had seen on the side of the road. The description of the accident damage matched perfectly with what we had observed. The rear end of their car had been completely destroyed in the collision, exactly as we had seen it. Over the years since the accident, there had been multiple reports from drivers who claimed to have seen the Mitchell family standing beside a damaged car on that stretch of highway. Most of these reports were dismissed as fatigue-induced hallucinations or urban legends, but the descriptions were remarkably consistent. A family of 4, dressed in formal clothing from an earlier era, standing beside a severely damaged car, but showing no signs of injury themselves. I contacted the Georgia State Patrol and filed a report about our encounter, adding our experience to what was apparently a long list of similar sightings. The officer I spoke with was professional, but clearly skeptical. He suggested that we had probably seen some combination of shadows, reflections, and existing debris that our tired minds had interpreted as people. But Marcus and I know what we saw that night. We both witnessed the same thing, down to the smallest details. The Mitchell family is still out there on Interstate 75, still trying to get help for their accident that happened 40 years ago. I do not know why they appear to certain travelers, or what they are hoping to accomplish, but I believe they are trapped somehow at the site of their tragic death. We never did figure out why we were able to see them when so many other people have driven past that spot without noticing anything unusual. Maybe it was the late hour, or our emotional state during the stressful move, or just pure chance. But I am grateful that we stopped, even though we could not help them in any meaningful way. At least the Mitchell family knows that someone still remembers them, and that their story has not been completely forgotten. My name is Ryan, and I am 35 years old. I work as a sales manager for a pharmaceutical company based in Phoenix, and my job requires me to travel frequently throughout the Southwest. I have driven hundreds of thousands of miles over the past decade, mostly at night when traffic is lighter and I can make better time between cities. I have always prided myself on being a safe and alert driver, but I also have a tendency to push myself too hard when I'm trying to meet tight deadlines. That combination of experience and overconfidence nearly got me killed on a desert highway near Flagstaff, Arizona, if not for an intervention that I still cannot explain. The incident happened in late September during one of the busiest periods of my sales cycle. I had spent 3 days in Phoenix attending a conference and meeting with potential clients, and I needed to be in Las Vegas by 10 a.m. the next morning for a crucial presentation to a hospital network that could bring in millions of dollars in revenue for my company. The smart thing would have been to fly, but my company was cutting travel costs and I was expected to drive whenever possible. The route from Phoenix to Las Vegas normally takes about 5 hours, but I figured if I left around 11 p.m., I could drive straight through and arrive with time to shower and grab breakfast before my meeting. I had made this drive many times before, so I was confident about the route and the timing. Interstate 17 north from Phoenix to Flagstaff, then Interstate 40 west to Kingman, and finally Highway 93 north to Las Vegas. Most of the drive is through empty desert, especially the stretch between Flagstaff and Kingman, where you can go for 50 miles without seeing another car or any signs of civilization. I actually enjoyed those long, quiet drives because they gave me time to think and plan my sales strategies without distractions. The first part of the trip went exactly as planned. I left Phoenix right on schedule and made excellent time through the Sonoran Desert. Traffic was practically non-existent and my car was running smoothly. I had a full tank of gas, a thermos of coffee, and my favorite playlist loaded on my phone. The desert landscape looked beautiful under the full moon, with the saguaro cacti casting long shadows across the rocky terrain. I was making such good time that I started thinking I might actually arrive in Las Vegas early enough to get a few hours of sleep before my presentation. As I approached Flagstaff around 1 a.m., I was feeling confident and alert. I had been driving for about 2 hours, but I was nowhere near tired. The mountain air was cool and refreshing compared to the heat in Phoenix, and I rolled down my windows to enjoy the change in atmosphere. Flagstaff looked peaceful in the early morning hours, with just a few lights visible in the downtown area and the San Francisco peaks looming majestically in the distance. I stopped at a 24-hour gas station on the outskirts of town to top off my tank and grab another cup of coffee. The attendant was a young guy who looked like he was struggling to stay awake during his overnight shift. He warned me to be careful driving through the mountains at night, especially on the stretch between Flagstaff and Williams where the road curves through dense forest and there is no cell phone coverage. I thanked him for the advice, but I assured him that I had driven that route many times and knew it well. Back on the highway, I merged onto Interstate 40 and headed west toward Kingman. This part of the drive takes you through the Kaibab National Forest, and the road winds through stands of tall ponderosa pines and across high desert plateaus. During the day, it is some of the most beautiful scenery in Arizona, but at night it can be monotonous and hypnotic. The headlights create a tunnel effect through the darkness, and it is easy to lose track of time and distance. I had been driving for about an hour west of Flagstaff when I started to feel the effects of the long day catching up with me. It was now past 2 a.m., and I had been awake since 6 a.m. the previous morning. My eyelids were getting heavy, and I found myself having to consciously focus on keeping my speed steady and staying in my lane. I turned up the radio and rolled the windows down further, hoping the cold air would help me stay alert. The problem was that there was nowhere to stop on this stretch of highway. The next town was Williams, still about 30 miles ahead, and there were no rest areas or even safe places to pull over between Flagstaff and there. The shoulders were narrow and uneven, and pulling over in the forest at night seemed more dangerous than continuing to drive. I convinced myself that I could make it to Williams, where I could stop for another cup of coffee and maybe walk around for a few minutes to clear my head. That decision almost cost me my life. About 10 miles outside of Williams, I hit a particularly monotonous stretch of straight highway through dense forest. The trees on both sides created a dark tunnel effect, and there were no other vehicles in sight. The rhythmic sound of my tires on the pavement and the gentle hum of the engine started to have a hypnotic effect. I found my eyelids getting heavier and heavier, and several times I caught myself drifting toward to the shoulder or the center line. I was fighting to stay awake when I reached a section of highway where Interstate 40 passes through the small community of Parks. There is a traffic light there, one of the few on the entire interstate system where the highway intersects with a local road. The speed limit drops from 75 miles per hour to 45 miles per hour as you approach the intersection, but at 2:30 in the morning, the area appears completely deserted. No traffic, no lights in any buildings, just the blinking red and yellow signals hanging over the empty highway. As I approached the intersection, I was probably doing about 70 miles per hour, which was way too fast for the reduced speed zone, but not unusual for that time of night when there was no other traffic around. The traffic light was showing green in my direction, so I had no reason to slow down. I was actually accelerating slightly, eager to get through the area and back to the open highway, where I could cruise at highway speeds again. That is when I heard the voice. It came from directly behind me, from the back seat of my car, and it was as clear and distinct as if someone was sitting there talking to me. A man's voice, older and authoritative, speaking in a calm but urgent tone. "Slow down," the voice said. "Slow down right now. Stop the car." I immediately glanced in my rearview mirror, but the back seat was empty. There was nobody in my car except me, and all the doors were locked. But the voice had been so clear and so close that I could not dismiss it as my imagination or fatigue-induced hallucination. Without really thinking about why, I hit the brakes and started slowing down rapidly. "Stop completely," the voice said again. "Do not go through that intersection." I brought my car to a complete stop about 100 feet before the traffic light, which was still showing green in my direction. I sat there for a moment, my heart pounding, trying to figure out what was happening. I looked around for any sign of danger or reason why I should not proceed through the intersection, but everything appeared normal. The road was empty, the light was green, and there were no obvious hazards. Then I heard the rumble of a large truck approaching from my left. A few seconds later, a massive semi-trailer came barreling through the intersection at high speed, running the red light without even slowing down. If I had continued at my original speed, I would have been right in the middle of that intersection when the truck came through. The collision would have killed me instantly. The truck disappeared into the darkness, and the intersection returned to its quiet state. I sat there for several more minutes, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, trying to process what had just happened. The voice had saved my life by warning me about a danger that I could not have seen or anticipated. But where had the voice come from? And how had it known about the approaching truck? As my heart rate started to return to normal, I heard the voice one more time. "You are safe now," it said in the same calm, authoritative tone. "Drive carefully the rest of the way." Then there was silence, and I never heard it again. I continued my drive to Las Vegas, but I was wide awake now and hyper-alert to every sound and movement. I could not stop thinking about what had happened at that intersection. Who or what had warned me about the truck? How had the voice known that the truck driver was going to run the red light? And why had I been chosen to receive this supernatural intervention? When I reached Las Vegas around 6 a.m., I immediately called the Arizona Highway Patrol to report the incident with the truck running the red light. The dispatcher took down the information, but when I mentioned hearing a voice that warned me to stop, she became noticeably less interested in my report. I could tell that she thought I was either lying or suffering from some kind of breakdown. Later that morning, after my presentation, I drove back to Parks to take another look at the intersection in daylight. It was just a typical rural traffic light, nothing particularly dangerous or unusual about it. I talked to a clerk at a nearby gas station and asked if there had been any accidents at that intersection recently. She said that there had been several fatal crashes there over the years, mostly involving vehicles that failed to stop for the traffic light late at night. She also told me something that made my blood run cold. About 5 years earlier, an Arizona Department of Transportation worker named Frank Morrison had been killed at that exact intersection while working on road maintenance. He had been struck by a drunk driver who ran the red light, and he died instantly. Frank had been known for his dedication to highway safety and his efforts to prevent accidents through better signage and traffic control measures. I have driven through that intersection many times since then, always during daylight hours, and I have never heard the voice again. But I am convinced that Frank Morrison saved my life that night, somehow warning me about the danger that I could not see coming. I do not understand how it happened or why I was chosen to receive his help, but I will never forget his warning or the calm authority in his voice when he told me to stop. I have become a much more careful driver since that experience. I no longer push myself to drive when I'm tired, and I always respect reduced speed zones and traffic signals, even when the roads appear to be empty. Most importantly, I've learned to listen to warnings, whether they come from visible sources or from voices that speak from beyond the grave. My name is Jack, and I am 29 years old. I work as a mechanic in Louisville, Kentucky, and I have been fixing cars and trucks for the better part of a decade. I know vehicles inside and out, from the sound of their engines to the way their headlights cut through the darkness. That knowledge made what happened to me on a back road in rural Kentucky all the more unsettling because I witnessed something that should not have existed outside of a vintage car show or a museum. The incident occurred in early November during deer hunting season. I had been invited by my uncle to join him at his hunting cabin about 60 miles southeast of Louisville, deep in the Daniel Boone National Forest. My uncle has owned this property for more than 20 years, and it is situated in some of the most remote and beautiful wilderness in Kentucky. The cabin sits on about 40 acres of mixed hardwood forest, with hiking trails that lead to limestone cliffs and hidden springs. I had made the drive to my uncle's cabin many times before, but always during daylight hours when I could appreciate the changing seasons and the spectacular fall foliage. This time, however, I got caught up working on a particularly complicated transmission repair at my shop and did not leave Louisville until after 7 p.m. By the time I reached the outskirts of the city, it was already dark, and I knew I would be driving unfamiliar mountain roads in complete darkness. The route to my uncle's cabin takes you off the main highways and onto increasingly narrow country roads that wind through small farming communities and patches of dense forest. The last 15 miles are on a gravel road that barely qualifies as 2 lanes, with steep drop-offs on one side and thick woods on the other. Cell phone coverage disappears completely once you get more than 5 miles from the nearest town, and GPS is essentially useless because many of these roads are not even mapped accurately. I had been driving for about an hour and a half when I turned onto the final stretch of gravel road that leads to my uncle's property. This particular road is known locally as Old Mill Road because it follows the path of a creek that once powered several grist mills in the 1800s. The road is in decent condition for a gravel surface, but it has a lot of sharp curves and blind hills that require careful attention, especially at night. About 10 minutes after turning onto Old Mill Road, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. This was unusual because the road essentially leads nowhere, except to a handful of hunting cabins and one old farmhouse that has been abandoned for years. During hunting season, you might encounter the occasional pickup truck heading to or from the various properties, but traffic is extremely rare, especially after dark on a weeknight. The vehicle behind me appeared to be maintaining a steady distance of maybe 200 yards, which was appropriate for the road conditions. I could tell from the height and spacing of the headlights that it was probably a pickup truck, which made sense for this area. I assumed it was another hunter heading to his cabin, or maybe a local resident who lived further back in the woods than I realized. I did not think much about it at first, but as we continued down the winding road, I started to notice that something was unusual about the truck following me. The headlights had a distinctive yellowish color that was different from modern halogen or LED lights. They looked more like the old sealed beam headlights that were used on vehicles from the 1940s and 1950s. The light pattern was also different, creating a softer, more diffused glow rather than the sharp, focused beams of contemporary headlights. I started paying more attention to the vehicle in my mirrors, trying to get a better look at it when we passed through areas with better visibility. At one point, we came to a relatively straight stretch of road that runs alongside the creek, and I got my first clear view of the truck behind me. It was definitely an older vehicle, probably from the late 1940s or early 1950s, based on the shape of the headlights and the height of the cab. The paint appeared to be a dark color, possibly black or dark blue, and the chrome bumper and grille were reflecting my taillights in a way that suggested they were in excellent condition. What struck me as odd was how well maintained the truck appeared to be. Most of the vintage vehicles you see in rural Kentucky are either completely restored show trucks or rusted out farm trucks that are held together with baling wire and prayer. This truck looked like it had just rolled off the assembly line 60 years ago. The engine sounded smooth and powerful, with the distinctive rumble of an old V8 that has been properly tuned and maintained. As we continued down Old Mill Road, the truck began to behave in an increasingly strange manner. Whenever I slowed down for a sharp curve or a steep hill, it would slow down as well, maintaining that same 200-yard distance. But when we reached straight stretches where it would have been safe to pass, the truck would speed up and close the distance between us, as if the driver was considering overtaking me, but then changing his mind at the last second. This pattern continued for several miles. The truck would appear to be getting ready to pass, closing to within maybe 50 yards of my rear bumper, but then it would drop back to its original following distance without ever pulling into the oncoming lane. I started to get the impression that the driver was either being overly cautious about passing on an unfamiliar road, or there was something preventing him from completing the maneuver. Finally, we reached a section of road that runs through a valley with open fields on both sides. This is the best passing zone on Old Mill Road, with good visibility for at least a quarter mile in each direction and plenty of room to safely overtake slower vehicles. I slowed down and moved as far to the right as I could, expecting the truck to finally pass me and continue on to wherever it was going. The truck closed the distance quickly, and I could hear its engine revving as it accelerated. But just as it drew alongside my vehicle, something very strange happened. Instead of passing me and continuing down the road, the truck simply disappeared. One moment I could see it in my peripheral vision, hear the sound of its engine, and feel the vibration of its powerful V8 through my steering wheel. The next moment, it was gone completely, as if it had never been there at all. I immediately pulled over to the side of the road and got out of my car to look around. The night was clear and quiet, with excellent visibility in all directions. There were no other vehicles anywhere in sight. No sound of an engine or tires on gravel. No dust cloud that would indicate a truck had suddenly turned off the road or accelerated away at high speed. The truck had simply vanished without a trace. I stood there for several minutes, trying to figure out what had happened. There were no side roads or driveways where the truck could have turned off. The fields on both sides of the road were separated from the pavement by barbed wire fences, and there were no gates or openings where a vehicle could have left the road. The truck had been right next to me, close enough that I should have been able to see the driver's face, and then it was gone. I eventually got back in my car and continued to my uncle's cabin, but I was deeply shaken by the experience. When I arrived, my uncle was sitting on the porch waiting for me with a cup of coffee and a concerned expression. He said he had been expecting me for over an hour and was starting to worry that I had gotten lost or had car trouble. I told him about the phantom truck, describing the vehicle and its strange behavior in detail. My uncle listened to my story without interruption, nodding occasionally, but not saying much until I finished. Then he got up and went inside, returning a few minutes later with an old photograph album. He flipped through several pages of family pictures until he found what he was looking for, then handed me the album and pointed to a specific photograph. The picture showed a group of men standing around a dark blue 1947 Chevrolet pickup truck. The truck was identical to the one I had seen on Old Mill Road, down to the chrome bumper and the distinctive headlight configuration. My uncle explained that the truck had belonged to his grandfather, who had used it for farming and occasional trips to town. The old man had died in 1962, and the truck had been sold to pay for his funeral expenses. According to my uncle, his grandfather had driven that same stretch of Old Mill Road hundreds of times over the years, often late at night when he was coming home from poker games in town or checking on his livestock during bad weather. The old man had been an aggressive driver who was known for passing slower vehicles even in questionable situations, and he had received several tickets from the state police for reckless driving and speeding. My uncle also told me that I was not the first person to report seeing a vintage truck on Old Mill Road that exhibited strange behavior and then disappeared without explanation. Over the years, several other drivers had described encounters with what sounded like the same vehicle, always during nighttime hours and always in the same general area where I had seen it. Most people dismissed these reports as fatigue-induced hallucinations or tricks of the light, but my uncle believed that his grandfather was still out there, still driving his beloved truck on the roads he had traveled in life. I have driven Old Mill Road many times since that night, but I have never seen the phantom truck again. However, I have talked to several other hunters and local residents who have had similar experiences with what they describe as a vintage pickup truck that follows them for miles and then vanishes without explanation. The descriptions are remarkably consistent, always involving a dark-colored truck from the 1940s or 1950s with distinctive yellowish headlights and a powerful-sounding engine. I am convinced that what I saw that night was the ghost of my uncle's grandfather, still making his nocturnal journeys on the familiar roads of his former home. I do not know why he chose to follow me or what he was trying to accomplish, but I believe he was simply continuing the driving patterns that had been such an important part of his life. Perhaps he was protecting other drivers by ensuring they maintained safe speeds on the dangerous curves, or maybe he was just enjoying the freedom of the open road that he loved so much when he was alive. Whatever the explanation, the experience has given me a deeper respect for the history and legends of rural Kentucky. These old roads have seen generations of travelers, and some of them apparently continue their journeys long after their earthly lives have ended. I no longer dismiss ghost stories or supernatural encounters as mere superstition. I know that there are forces in this world that cannot be explained by logic or science, and sometimes those forces choose to reveal themselves to those who are open to witnessing something beyond the ordinary. My name is Sarah, and I am 33 years old. I work as a registered nurse at a hospital in Minneapolis, and I have always prided myself on being logical and level-headed in crisis situations. My job requires me to remain calm under pressure and to trust only what I can observe and verify. That practical mindset served me well in my career, but it was completely shattered during a weekend getaway to Lake Superior when my sister and I encountered something that still makes me question everything I thought I knew about reality. This happened in late October of last year. My younger sister Kate had been going through a difficult divorce, and I thought a quiet weekend by the lake would help her clear her head and process everything that was happening in her life. We decided to drive up to Grand Marais, which is a small town on the North Shore that we had visited several times as children with our parents. The area holds a lot of happy memories for both of us, and I hoped that returning there would provide Kate with some peace and perspective. We left Minneapolis on Friday evening after I finished my shift at the hospital. The drive to Grand Marais normally takes about 4 hours, but we planned to take our time and stop for dinner somewhere along the way. Highway 61 follows the shoreline of Lake Superior and offers some of the most beautiful scenery in Minnesota, especially during the fall when the maple and aspen trees are changing colors. Even though it would be dark for most of the drive, I knew Kate would enjoy the peaceful atmosphere and the sound of the waves crashing against the rocky shore. The first part of the trip went exactly as planned. We stopped for dinner in Duluth and spent some time walking around Canal Park, watching the ships come and go from the harbor. Kate seemed to be relaxing for the first time in months, and I was optimistic that the weekend would help her start to heal from the emotional trauma of her divorce. We got back on Highway 61 around 9 p.m., planning to reach our bed and breakfast in Grand Marais by midnight. The highway between Duluth and Grand Marais is one of the most remote stretches of road in Minnesota. It winds along the lakeshore through the Superior National Forest, passing through tiny communities that consist of a little more than a few houses and maybe a general store. During the day, the scenery is spectacular, but at night, the road can feel isolated and somewhat eerie. The dense forest comes right up to the edge of the pavement, and you can go for miles without seeing any lights from houses or businesses. We had been driving for about an hour when Kate dozed off in the passenger seat. I did not mind driving alone because the road was familiar to me and traffic was practically non-existent. The radio was playing soft classical music, and I was enjoying the solitude and the opportunity to think about things without the constant distractions of city life. Occasionally, I would catch glimpses of the lake through the trees, with moonlight reflecting off the dark water. It was around 11 p.m. when I first saw them. We were approaching a small community called Beaver Bay when my headlights illuminated two small figures walking along the right side of the highway. At first, I thought they might be deer or other wildlife, which would not have been unusual in that area. But as I got closer, I realized that they were children, a boy and a girl who appeared to be maybe 8 to 10 years old. They were walking single file along the narrow shoulder of the highway, both wearing what looked like matching pajamas or nightgowns. The boy was slightly taller and appeared to be leading the way, while the girl followed a few steps behind him. Neither of them seemed to be aware of my approaching headlights, and they were walking at a steady pace as if they knew exactly where they were going. My first instinct was to pull over and find out what was wrong. It was after 11 p.m. on a cold October night, and these children were walking along a remote highway in their pajamas. They were obviously in some kind of trouble, possibly lost or running away from home. I slowed down and started looking for a safe place to stop, but the shoulder was very narrow, and there were steep embankments on both sides of the road. As I drew alongside the children, I rolled down my window and called out to them, asking if they needed help. Both of them turned to look at me, and I got my first clear view of their faces. They were both pale and thin, with large dark eyes that seemed much too old for their young faces. The boy had dark hair that looked like it had been cut with scissors by someone who was not very skilled at it. The girl had lighter hair that was tangled and unkempt. What struck me most about their appearance was how calm they seemed. They did not look frightened or upset despite being alone on a dark highway in the middle of the night. They just stared at me with those large, solemn eyes, as if they were trying to decide whether I could be trusted. I asked them again if they needed help and where their parents were, but neither of them responded. I managed to find a place to pull over about 100 yards ahead of where the children were walking. I put on my hazard lights and got out of the car, being careful not to wake Kate. I walked back toward the children, calling out to them and explaining that I was a nurse and that I wanted to help them get home safely. But as I approached the spot where I had seen them, they were nowhere to be found. I looked up and down the highway, but there was no sign of the children anywhere. The shoulder was too narrow for them to have moved very far from the road, and the forest was too dense for them to have disappeared into the woods quickly enough to be out of sight. I called out to them several times, thinking that maybe they were hiding because they were afraid of strangers, but there was no response. I walked back to the car and woke Kate up to tell her what had happened. She was groggy at first, but when I explained about the children, she became fully alert and offered to help me search for them. We drove slowly back and forth along that stretch of highway for about 30 minutes, using our cell phone flashlights to scan the woods on both sides of the road. We never found any trace of the children. Eventually, we decided to continue to Grand Marais and report what we had seen to the local authorities. When we arrived at our bed and breakfast around 12:30 a.m., the owner was still awake and greeted us at the front desk. I told him about the children we had seen, and his expression immediately became very serious. He asked me to describe exactly where we had seen them and what they had looked like. After I finished my description, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he told us something that made my blood run cold. In 1971, there had been a house fire in Beaver Bay that had killed an entire family. The parents and their teenage son had managed to escape, but two younger children, a boy named Tommy and a girl named Susan, had died from smoke inhalation. They were 8 and 10 years old respectively, and they had been wearing their pajamas when the fire started. According to the bed and breakfast owner, there had been numerous reports over the years of people seeing two children in pajamas walking along Highway 61 near Beaver Bay, always late at night and always heading in the direction of where their house had stood before it burned down. Most people who reported these sightings were tourists or travelers who were unfamiliar with the local history, and their descriptions were remarkably consistent. The next morning, Kate and I drove back to the area where I had seen the children. In daylight, we could see that there was indeed an old foundation and some burned timbers in the woods, about a quarter mile from the highway. A local historian at the county museum confirmed that this had been the site of the Peterson family home that had burned in 1971. Tommy and Susan Peterson had been buried in the Beaver Bay Cemetery, and their graves were marked with small headstones that bore their names and the dates of their short lives. We visited the cemetery before driving back to Minneapolis, and I left flowers on both graves. I do not know why Kate and I were chosen to see Tommy and Susan that night, or what they were trying to accomplish by walking along that highway. But I believe they were making the same journey they had made many times in life, walking from their house to visit friends or relatives in the area. The experience has changed my perspective on life and death in ways I never expected. As a nurse, I've been present when many patients have died, and I have always believed that death was simply the end of consciousness and physical existence. But seeing those children has made me realize that there may be aspects of human existence that continue beyond death, especially when that death is sudden and traumatic. I have driven Highway 61 several times since that October night, but I have never seen Tommy and Susan again. However, I have made it a point to donate to local children's charities in their memory, and I have become involved with a non-profit organization that helps families recover from house fires. I like to think that by helping other children who are facing similar tragedies, I am honoring the memory of two children who died too young and who may still be wandering the roads of their childhood, searching for a way to find peace. Kate and I still talk about that night sometimes, and we both agree that seeing those children was one of the most profound experiences of our lives. It reminded us that there are mysteries in this world that cannot be explained by science or logic, and that sometimes the dead find ways to make their presence known to the living. Whether Tommy and Susan were trying to lead us to their graves, or simply continuing the innocent wanderings of their childhood, I will never forget the sight of those two small figures walking along a dark highway, still wearing the pajamas they had dyed in more than 50 years ago. My name is Michael, and I am 38 years old. I work as an accountant in Dallas, and I have always been the type of person who likes to plan everything down to the smallest detail. I keep detailed maintenance records for my car. I always check the weather before traveling, and I carry emergency supplies in my trunk just in case something goes wrong. That methodical approach to life has served me well in both my career and my personal relationships, but it could not have prepared me for what happened during a solo camping trip to Big Bend National Park, when I encountered someone who should not have existed. This incident occurred in early April of last year. I had been working extremely long hours during tax season, and my doctor had started expressing concern about my stress levels and blood pressure. He recommended that I take some time off to relax and decompress, so I decided to spend a long weekend camping in one of my favorite places in Texas. Big Bend National Park is about 350 miles southwest of Dallas, and it offers some of the most remote and beautiful desert scenery in the country. I left Dallas on Thursday evening after finishing up with my last client of the day. The drive to Big Bend normally takes about 6 hours, but I was in no hurry and planned to stop for dinner somewhere along the way. The route takes you through some fairly small towns in Central and West Texas, and then the last 100 miles are through increasingly remote desert country where you can drive for 30 or 40 miles without seeing another vehicle. I had made this drive many times before, so I knew exactly where the gas stations were and how to pace my fuel stops. My car is a reliable sedan that gets good mileage, but I always make sure to keep the tank full when traveling through remote areas. The desert can be unforgiving if you get stranded without water or communication, and cell phone coverage becomes very spotty once you get more than 50 miles from any major town. Everything went smoothly for the first 4 hours of the drive. I stopped for dinner in a small town called Sonora and topped off my gas tank while I was there. The weather was perfect, with clear skies and comfortable temperatures, and I was looking forward to spending 3 days hiking and photographing the desert landscape. By the time I reached Fort Stockton, which is about halfway to Big Bend, I was feeling relaxed and optimistic about the weekend ahead. The problem started about 30 miles south of Fort Stockton, on a particularly desolate stretch of highway that runs through ranch country and oil fields. I had been driving for about 20 minutes without seeing another vehicle when I noticed that my temperature gauge was starting to climb above the normal range. At first, I thought it might just be a temporary fluctuation, but within a few minutes, the needle was approaching the red zone. I immediately pulled over to the side of the road and turned off the engine. When I popped the hood, I could see steam rising from the radiator area, and there was a distinct smell of antifreeze in the air. I let the engine cool down for about 15 minutes, then carefully removed the radiator cap to check the coolant level. The reservoir was completely empty, which meant I either had a leak or the cooling system had failed in some other way. I always carry a gallon of water and some basic tools in my trunk, so I added water to the radiator and started the engine to see if that would solve the problem. The temperature gauge stayed in the normal range for about 5 minutes, then started climbing again. It was clear that I had a significant coolant leak somewhere in the system, and I was going to need professional help to fix it. The real problem was my location. I was on a remote highway at 10:30 p.m. on a Thursday night, more than 30 miles from the nearest town in either direction. Cell phone coverage was non-existent, and I had not seen another vehicle for at least 20 minutes. I started thinking about my options, none of which were particularly appealing. I could try to drive slowly toward Fort Stockton and hope the engine did not overheat completely, or I could stay with the car and wait for another vehicle to come by. I was standing by my car trying to decide what to do when I saw headlights approaching from the south. As the vehicle got closer, I could see that it was an old pickup truck, probably from the 1960s or early 1970s, based on its distinctive shape and the sound of its engine. I waved at the truck as it approached, hoping the driver would stop to help or at least let me use a cell phone if he had one. The truck slowed down and pulled over behind my car. The driver was an elderly man, probably in his 70s, wearing a well-worn cowboy hat and a faded work shirt. He had the weathered look of someone who had spent his entire life working outdoors, with deep lines around his eyes and hands that showed the calluses and scars of decades of manual labor. Despite his age, he moved with the confident ease of someone who was still physically capable and mentally sharp. He introduced himself simply as Frank and asked what kind of trouble I was having. When I explained about the overheating problem and the coolant leak, he nodded knowingly and said that it sounded like a failed radiator hose. He walked around to the front of my car and examined the engine compartment with a small flashlight that he produced from his shirt pocket. Within a few minutes, he had located the problem. The upper radiator hose had developed a split along its length, allowing coolant to spray out whenever the engine was running. Frank explained that this was a fairly common problem on cars of my make and model, especially in hot weather when the rubber components are under extra stress from heat expansion. He said that the hose would need to be replaced, but that there might be a temporary fix that would get me to the nearest town where I could find a parts store. Frank went back to his truck and returned with a roll of duct tape and a small knife. He carefully cleaned the area around the split in the hose, then wrapped it tightly with several layers of tape. He explained that this was not a permanent solution, but that it should hold long enough for me to drive to Fort Stockton if I kept my speed down and monitored the temperature gauge carefully. While he was working on the hose, I tried to offer him money for his help, but he waved me off with a smile. He said that he had been helped by strangers many times over the years, and that he was happy to return the favor. When I persisted in trying to pay him, he said, "Just pay it forward, son. Help somebody else when you get the chance." Frank refilled my radiator with the water from my trunk, then had me start the engine to check his repair. The temperature gauge remained steady, and there was no sign of any coolant leaking from the patched hose. He advised me to drive slowly and to stop every few miles to check the engine temperature, but he was confident that the temporary fix would get me to safety. I thanked him profusely and asked if there was anything I could do to repay his kindness. He just smiled and said that seeing me get safely to town would be payment enough. Then he got back in his old truck and drove away toward the south, disappearing into the darkness with a friendly wave out his window. The temporary repair worked perfectly. I drove slowly to Fort Stockton, checking the temperature gauge constantly, and made it to a motel without any problems. The next morning, I found an auto parts store and had the radiator hose properly replaced. The mechanic who did the work was impressed with the quality of Frank's emergency repair and said that it had been applied by someone who clearly knew what he was doing. I continued on to Big Bend and had a wonderful weekend camping and hiking in the desert. But I could not stop thinking about Frank and his kindness to a stranger in distress. When I returned to Dallas, I made a point of looking for opportunities to help other motorists who were having car trouble. Over the past year, I have stopped to assist at least a dozen drivers who were stranded with flat tires, dead batteries, or mechanical problems. It was not until several months later that I learned something that made me reconsider everything about my encounter with Frank. I was telling the story to a colleague at work who had grown up in West Texas, and he asked me to describe the man who had helped me. When I mentioned the cowboy hat, the old pickup truck, and Frank's name, my colleague got a strange look on his face. He told me about a man named Frank Gonzalez who had been legendary in that part of Texas for helping stranded motorists. Frank had worked for the highway department for more than 30 years and had a reputation for going out of his way to assist travelers who were having car trouble. He would often stop on his way home from work to help people fix flat tires, jumpstart dead batteries, or provide emergency repairs to get them to the nearest town. According to my colleague, Frank Gonzalez had died in 1995 when he stopped to help a family whose car had broken down on that same stretch of highway where I had met Frank. A drunk driver had swerved off the road and struck Frank while he was working under the hood of the stranded car. He had been killed instantly, but his actions had saved the family who would have been hit if Frank had not pushed them out of the way at the last second. When I heard this story, I realized that the man who had helped me could not have been Frank Gonzalez. The timeline did not match, and Frank had been dead for more than 20 years when I encountered him. But the description was too accurate to be a coincidence, and the location was exactly the same stretch of highway where Frank had been killed while helping other travelers. I drove back to that area a few weeks later to investigate further. I stopped at a gas station in Fort Stockton and asked the elderly attendant if he remembered Frank Gonzalez. His eyes lit up immediately, and he told me several stories about Frank's legendary helpfulness and mechanical skills. He also showed me a photograph that had been hanging on the wall of the station for many years. A picture of local highway workers from the early 1990s. Frank was in the photograph, and he looked exactly like the man who had helped me repair my radiator hose. The same weathered face, the same cowboy hat, and the same confident smile. There was no doubt that the man in the photograph was the same person who had stopped to help me, even though he had been dead for more than 2 decades. I've never been able to explain what happened that night on the remote Texas highway. I do not believe in ghosts or supernatural phenomena, but I cannot deny what I experienced. Frank Gonzalez helped me fix my car and get safely to town, just as he had helped countless other travelers during his lifetime. Perhaps his spirit continues to patrol that stretch of highway, still looking for opportunities to assist people who are in trouble. The experience has changed my perspective on helping others and on the possibility that some forms of human kindness transcend death itself. I have made it a priority to stop and help stranded motorists whenever I can do so safely, and I always remember Frank's advice to pay it forward. Whether he was a ghost, an angel, or something else entirely, Frank Gonzalez taught me that true generosity creates a legacy that can continue long after we are gone. My name is Amanda, and I am 25 years old. I am currently a graduate student at the University of Chicago, working on my master's degree in social work. I have always been a practical person who approaches life with a healthy dose of skepticism, especially when it comes to things that cannot be explained by logic or science. That rational mindset served me well throughout college and in my academic pursuits, but it was completely shattered during what should have been a routine drive home from spring break when I stopped at a diner that should not have existed. This happened during my senior year of college in March of 2022. I had spent spring break visiting my boyfriend at Northwestern University, and I was driving back to the University of Chicago on a Sunday night. The drive between the two campuses normally takes about an hour, but I had stayed later than planned and did not leave until around 11 p.m. I was tired from a week of partying and sightseeing, and I was not particularly looking forward to the drive back to campus, where I had an 8 a.m. class the next morning. I decided to take Highway 41 south instead of the interstate because traffic would be lighter, and I could make better time. Highway 41 runs through some rural areas of northeastern Illinois, passing through small farming communities and stretches of prairie that can feel quite isolated at night. During the day, it is a pleasant drive with nice scenery, but after dark, it can be monotonous and hypnotic, especially when you are already tired. I had been driving for about 40 minutes when I started to feel the effects of my exhausting week catching up with me. My eyelids were getting heavy, and I was having trouble maintaining a consistent speed. I knew I needed caffeine or a short break to clear my head, but most of the small towns along Highway 41 roll up their sidewalks pretty early, especially on Sunday nights. I was hoping to find a gas station or truck stop that might still be open, but I had not seen anything promising for several miles. That is when I saw the glow of neon lights ahead on the right side of the highway. As I got closer, I could make out the distinctive shape of a classic American diner, complete with large windows, chrome trim, and a red neon sign that said Rosie's Diner in flowing script letters. The parking lot had several cars in it, which was a good sign that the place was actually open and serving food. I pulled into the parking lot and took a moment to look around. The diner appeared to be from the 1950s or early 1960s, with the kind of streamlined design that was popular during the golden age of American car culture. The exterior was painted in alternating stripes of red and white, and there were small chrome details that caught the light from the neon signs. Through the large windows, I could see customers sitting at the counter and in booths, and there was warm, yellow light spilling out onto the parking lot. When I walked through the front door, I was immediately struck by how authentic everything looked. The interior was a perfect recreation of a 1950s diner, with black and white checkered floor tiles, red vinyl booths, and a long counter with swivel stools. Behind the counter was a grill area where I could see a cook working, and there were pie cases displaying what looked like homemade desserts. The jukebox in the corner was playing Buddy Holly, and there was a general atmosphere of warmth and nostalgia that made me feel like I had stepped back in time. The other customers in the diner were dressed in a style that seemed consistent with the 1950s theme. The men wore button-down shirts and slacks, while the women had carefully styled hair and dresses that looked like they came from a different era. Everyone seemed to be having quiet conversations over coffee and late-night meals, and there was a peaceful, unhurried quality to the atmosphere that was very appealing after my long day of traveling. A waitress, who appeared to be in her 60s, approached me with a warm smile and a menu. She was wearing a traditional white uniform with a small apron, and her gray hair was styled in a way that reminded me of photographs from my grandmother's era. She showed me to a booth near the window and asked what I would like to drink. I ordered coffee and asked for a few minutes to look at the menu. The menu was extensive, featuring classic diner fare like burgers, meatloaf, and pot roast, along with a variety of pies and other desserts. The prices seemed remarkably reasonable, almost too good to be true for the quality and portion sizes that were described. I decided to order a slice of apple pie and another cup of coffee to help me stay alert for the rest of my drive. While I was waiting for my order, I looked around the diner more carefully and noticed some details that struck me as unusual. All of the other customers seemed to be having conversations, but I could not quite make out what they were saying. Their voices were just low enough to be indistinguishable, creating a constant murmur of background noise that was somehow both comforting and slightly unsettling. The waitress returned with my pie and coffee, both of which were absolutely delicious. The pie was clearly homemade, with a flaky crust and perfectly spiced filling that reminded me of my grandmother's baking. The coffee was strong and hot, exactly what I needed to help me stay awake for the remainder of my drive. I ate slowly, savoring the food and enjoying the peaceful atmosphere of the diner. When I finished eating, I asked the waitress for my check. She smiled and said it would be just a few dollars, which seemed incredibly reasonable for the quality of the food and service. I reached for my wallet to pay, but when I opened it, I discovered that my credit cards were not working with their payment system. The cash register appeared to be an antique model that only accepted cash, and the waitress apologized for the inconvenience. I had some cash with me, so I left what I thought was a fair amount on the table, along with a generous tip. The waitress thanked me and wished me a safe trip home. As I walked toward the door, I turned back to wave goodbye and noticed that all of the other customers had stopped their conversations and were watching me leave. They all smiled and nodded politely, but there was something about their expressions that seemed almost wistful, as if they were sorry to see me go. I got back in my car and continued south on Highway 41 toward Chicago. The caffeine had done its job, and I felt much more alert and focused. The rest of the drive passed without incident, and I arrived at my dorm around 1 a.m. feeling grateful for the pleasant break at Rosie's Diner. The next morning, I told my roommate about the charming diner I had discovered on Highway 41. She was a local girl who had grown up in the area, and she knew all of the restaurants and attractions along that route. When I described Rosie's Diner and its location, she looked at me with a puzzled expression and said that there was no diner in that area. She suggested that I might have gotten confused about the location or the name of the restaurant. That afternoon, I decided to drive back to the spot where I was certain I had stopped the night before. I remembered the exact location because it was right across from a distinctive red barn that had been clearly visible in my headlights. But when I reached that spot, there was nothing there except an empty lot with some concrete foundations and scattered debris. There was no sign of a diner, no neon lights, and no indication that any building had been there recently. Confused and more than a little disturbed, I stopped at a gas station a few miles down the road and asked the attendant about Rosie's Diner. He was an older man who had lived in the area for many years, and he told me something that made my blood run cold. There had indeed been a diner called Rosie's at that location, but it had burned down in 1967. The fire had started in the kitchen late at night, and several customers and employees had been trapped inside. The building had been a total loss, and the property had never been rebuilt. The attendant also mentioned that over the years, several drivers had reported seeing lights and activity at that location late at night, but most people assumed it was just reflections from passing cars or fatigue-induced hallucinations. When I told him that I had actually stopped there and eaten a meal, he looked at me like I was either lying or suffering from some kind of mental breakdown. I drove back to Chicago that day, feeling deeply unsettled by what had happened. When I reached my dorm room, I emptied my purse to look for the receipt from the diner, hoping that it would prove that my experience had been real. I found a small piece of paper that I had not noticed before, with Rosie's Diner, printed at the top in faded blue ink. The receipt was dated from the night before, but the paper looked old and yellowed, as if it had been sitting in a drawer for decades. I kept that receipt for several months, showing it to friends and family members who all insisted that there must be some logical explanation for what had happened. But gradually the paper became more and more faded until it was completely blank. Eventually it crumbled into dust when I tried to handle it, leaving me with no physical evidence of my experience except for my memories and the lingering taste of that perfect apple pie. I have driven Highway 41 many times since then, always during daylight hours, and I have never seen any trace of Rosie's Diner again. But I know that what I experienced that night was real. I was served a meal by people who had been dead for more than 50 years, in a restaurant that had burned down decades before I was born. I do not understand how it happened or why I was chosen to experience it, but I will never forget the warmth and kindness of the staff at Rosie's Diner, or the comfort they provided to a tired college student on a long drive home. The experience has made me more open to possibilities that cannot be explained by conventional logic or science. Sometimes the past finds ways to reach into the present, offering comfort and assistance to those who need it most. Whether it was the spirits of the people who died in the fire, or some kind of temporal anomaly that allowed me to visit the diner as it existed in its heyday, I am grateful for that night when I found exactly what I needed in a place that should not have existed. My name is Brandon, and I'm 32 years old. I work as an electrician in Nashville, and I have always been passionate about motorcycles and vintage cars. I spend most of my free time working on classic vehicles or taking long rides through the countryside on my motorcycle. I thought I had seen every kind of automotive enthusiast and vehicle collector during my years in the hobby, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered during a solo motorcycle trip along the historic Natchez Trace Parkway when I found myself racing against a car that should not have existed. This incident occurred in late June of last year. I had taken a long weekend off from work to explore some of the scenic routes through Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi. The Natchez Trace Parkway is a 444-mile road that follows an ancient path used by Native Americans, early explorers, and settlers traveling between Nashville and Natchez. The modern parkway was built to preserve the historical significance of the original trace, while providing access to some of the most beautiful and unspoiled wilderness in the southeast. I had ridden portions of the Natchez Trace before, but I had never attempted to cover the entire length in a single trip. My plan was to start in Nashville on Friday morning and ride south through Tennessee and Alabama, then spend Friday night in Tupelo, Mississippi. On Saturday, I would continue south to Natchez and then take the interstate highways back to Nashville on Sunday. It was an ambitious schedule, but the weather forecast was perfect, and I was eager to experience the full length of this historic route. The first day of my trip went exactly as planned. The Natchez Trace Parkway is one of the most motorcycle-friendly roads in the country, with smooth pavement, gentle curves, and virtually no commercial traffic. The speed limit is only 50 miles per hour, which allows you to really appreciate the scenery and the historical significance of the sites along the route. I stopped at several of the interpretive centers and historical markers, learning about the Native American cultures and pioneer settlements that had shaped the region. By late afternoon, I had crossed into Alabama and was making excellent progress toward my planned overnight stop in Tupelo. The landscape was gorgeous, with rolling hills covered in dense hardwood forests and occasional glimpses of rivers and streams through the trees. I was feeling relaxed and confident about my pace, and I was looking forward to exploring some of the Civil War battlefields and historical sites in the Tupelo area. It was around 7 p.m. when I first became aware of the car behind me. I had been riding alone for most of the day, encountering only the occasional Park Service vehicle or tourist car. The Natchez Trace does not allow commercial trucks, and the strict speed limit tends to discourage casual traffic, so it is usually a very peaceful and uncrowded road. When I glanced in my mirrors and saw headlights approaching from behind, I assumed it was just another motorcycle rider or vintage car enthusiast taking advantage of the beautiful evening weather. As the vehicle got closer, I could see that it was indeed a car, and it appeared to be moving much faster than the posted speed limit. The Natchez Trace Parkway has very strict enforcement of traffic laws, and speeding violations can result in substantial fines and even criminal charges. I was surprised that any driver would risk such aggressive behavior on a road that is heavily patrolled by park rangers and state police. The car closed the distance between us quickly, and soon it was right behind me, maintaining a distance of maybe 20 or 30 feet. I moved as far to the right as I could to give the driver room to pass, but instead of overtaking me, the car just stayed behind me at that close distance. I could hear the sound of its engine over the noise of my motorcycle, and it had a distinctive rumble that suggested a powerful V8 from an earlier era. When we reached a straight section with good visibility, I slowed down and moved completely onto the shoulder to encourage the car to pass. Instead of going around me, the driver slowed down as well and continued following me at the same close distance. This pattern continued for several miles, with the car accelerating when I accelerated and slowing when I slowed, but never attempting to pass, despite numerous opportunities to do so safely. I started to get concerned about the driver's intentions, so I decided to get a better look at the vehicle. At the next historical marker, I pulled into the parking area and stopped to see what the driver would do. The car followed me into the parking area and stopped about 50 feet away. In the fading daylight, I could finally get a clear view of what I was dealing with. The car was a 1950s-era sports car, probably a Jaguar or Ferrari based on its low-slung profile and distinctive exhaust note. It appeared to be painted in racing colors, with a white body and blue racing stripes running down the center. The car looked like it was in pristine condition, as if it had just been restored or had rolled off a showroom floor 60 years ago. What struck me as odd was that I could not see the driver clearly, even though the car did not appear to have tinted windows. After a few minutes, the car started moving again, slowly circling the parking area before heading back toward the parkway. I decided to follow it, curious about where it was going and who was driving it. The car accelerated back onto the main road, and I followed at a safe distance. Almost immediately, the driver began driving much more aggressively, taking curves at speeds that seemed impossible for the road conditions. The Natchez Trace has many sharp curves and steep hills, especially in the section that passes through the Tennessee River Valley. The posted speed limit of 50 miles per hour is designed to ensure safe navigation of these challenging sections, and even experienced motorcycle riders need to be careful not to exceed safe speeds for the conditions. But the car ahead of me was taking curves at what must have been 70 or 80 miles per hour, cornering with a precision and confidence that seemed almost supernatural. I found myself trying to keep up with the car, despite knowing that it was dangerous and probably illegal. My motorcycle is a high-performance sport bike that is capable of impressive speeds and handling, but I was being pushed to my limits trying to match the pace of the car ahead of me. The driver seemed to know every curve and hill on the road, taking the optimal racing line through each corner and maintaining speeds that should have resulted in loss of control or accidents. As we continued south through the Alabama section of the parkway, the road became even more challenging, with tighter curves and steeper grades. The car ahead of me continued to maintain its reckless pace, and I realized that I was being led away from the main parkway route. We had turned onto a smaller road that I did not recognize from my maps or GPS, heading into what appeared to be a more remote and heavily forested area. The secondary road was narrower than the main parkway, with no guardrails or shoulders. It wound through dense woods and across several small bridges that spanned creeks and ravines. I started to get concerned about where we were going and whether I would be able to find my way back to the main road if I lost sight of the car. But the racing had become almost hypnotic, and I felt compelled to continue following despite my growing uneasiness. After about 20 minutes of high-speed driving on increasingly remote roads, we reached what appeared to be the remains of an old racetrack. There were concrete barriers and metal posts that looked like they had once supported grandstands or timing equipment. Weeds and small trees had grown up through cracks in what had once been a paved racing surface, but the basic layout of an oval track was still visible. The car ahead of me pulled into what had once been the pit area and stopped. I stopped as well, about 100 yards away, and turned off my engine to get a better sense of my surroundings. In the sudden silence, I could hear the sound of wind through the trees and the distant call of night birds, but there was no sound coming from the car that had led me here. As my eyes adjusted to the growing darkness, I walked closer to get a better look at the car and its driver, but as I approached, the car simply vanished. One moment, it was sitting there with its engine idling, and the next moment, it was gone completely. There was no sound of an engine starting or driving away, no dust cloud or tire tracks. The car had simply disappeared, leaving me alone in the ruins of what I now realized was an abandoned racetrack. I immediately pulled out my phone to try to get my GPS bearings, but there was no cell phone coverage in that remote location. I spent about 30 minutes exploring the area with my motorcycle's headlight, looking for some kind of historical marker or sign that would tell me where I was. Finally, I found a weathered concrete monument with barely legible text that indicated this had been the site of the Dixie Speedway, which had operated from 1951 to 1955. According to the monument, the track had been the scene of several fatal accidents during its brief operational period, including a crash in 1954 that had killed a promising young driver named Jimmy Patterson. Patterson had been driving a white Jaguar XK120 with blue racing stripes when he lost control during a night race and crashed into the concrete barrier at turn 3. He had died instantly, and the track had been closed permanently a few months later following additional safety concerns. I managed to find my way back to the main parkway by following the secondary road in the opposite direction from which I had come. The next morning, I stopped at the visitor center in Tupelo and asked a park ranger about the old Dixie Speedway. She confirmed that the track had existed and that there had been several fatal accidents there during the 1950s. She also mentioned that over the years, several motorcycle riders and sports car drivers had reported being led to the abandoned track by what appeared to be a vintage race car, always during evening hours and always following the same route that I had taken. The ranger showed me some historical photographs of the track during its operating years, including several pictures of Jimmy Patterson and his distinctive white Jaguar. The car in the photographs was identical to the one that had led me through the challenging curves and hills to the abandoned racetrack. There was no doubt that I had been following the ghost of Jimmy Patterson, still racing the roads near his final resting place more than 60 years after his death. I have never returned to that section of the Natchez Trace, and I have never again encountered anything like the racing ghost that led me on that wild chase through the Alabama countryside. But the experience has given me a deeper appreciation for the history and legends that surround America's historic highways. Sometimes the past refuses to stay buried, and sometimes the spirits of those who died pursuing their passions continue to haunt the places where they lived and died. Whether Jimmy Patterson was trying to show off his driving skills, relive his glory days, or simply share his love of racing with another enthusiast, I will never forget that night when I raced against a ghost on the winding roads near an abandoned speedway. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time, and it reminded me that there are forces in this world that cannot be explained by logic or science, but that can still touch our lives in profound and unforgettable ways. My name is Lisa, and I am 30 years old. I work as a marketing director for a tech company in Seattle, and I have always considered myself a very driven and focused person. My career has been the center of my life for most of my 20s, sometimes at the expense of my relationships with family and friends. I thought I had my priorities straight and that success in business was the most important thing I could achieve. That perspective was completely shattered during an emergency drive to a hospital in eastern Washington, when I encountered a passenger who taught me lessons about life and death that I will never forget. This happened in early December of last year. My father had been battling heart disease for several years, but he had always been stubborn about following his doctor's orders and taking his medications properly. He lived alone in a small town called Walla Walla, about 280 miles from Seattle, and he insisted on maintaining his independence despite repeated offers from my sister and me to help him find assisted living or move closer to one of us. On a Thursday evening, I was working late at the office when I received a call from Walla Walla General Hospital. A nurse told me that my father had been brought in by ambulance after suffering what appeared to be a massive heart attack. She said that his condition was extremely critical and that I needed to get there as quickly as possible if I wanted to see him before he died. The next flight to the area would not leave until morning, and she emphasized that waiting until then might be too late. I immediately left the office and raced home to pack some clothes and get my car. The drive from Seattle to Walla Walla normally takes about 4.5 hours under good conditions, but it was already 9 p.m. and I would be driving mountain passes in December weather. The forecast was calling for possible snow and freezing rain, which could make the trip much longer and more dangerous. But I had no choice. My father was dying, and I needed to be there. The first part of the drive went smoothly enough. Interstate 90 east from Seattle is a well-maintained highway, and traffic was light on a Thursday night. I made good time through the Cascade Mountains, and the weather held off despite the threatening clouds. I stopped only once for gas and coffee, trying to make up as much time as possible without being reckless. By the time I reached the Columbia River, I was starting to think I might actually reach the hospital before it was too late. It was around midnight when I turned south on Highway 12 toward Walla Walla. This is a more remote and winding road that follows the Columbia River through sparsely populated farm country. During the day, it offers beautiful views of wheat fields and vineyards, but at night it can feel isolated and desolate. The weather was starting to deteriorate, with light snow beginning to fall and the temperature dropping below freezing. About 30 miles outside of Walla Walla, I saw a man standing beside the road with his thumb out. This was unusual because hitchhiking is rare in that area, especially in the middle of the night during winter weather. The man appeared to be middle-aged, wearing a dark coat and dress pants that looked inappropriate for the cold conditions. He was not carrying any luggage or backpack, just standing calmly by the roadside, as if he was waiting for a specific ride. Under normal circumstances, I would never pick up a hitchhiker, especially late at night in a remote area. But something about the situation made me feel like I should stop. Maybe it was the stress of my father's condition, or maybe I was just feeling vulnerable and in need of human companionship during the difficult drive. For whatever reason, I pulled over and offered the man a ride. He got into the passenger seat and thanked me politely for stopping. He appeared to be in his 50s or early 60s, with graying hair and a kind face that reminded me somehow of my father. His clothes were clean and well-maintained, but they seemed out of date, as if they had been purchased many years earlier. He spoke with a slight accent that I could not quite identify, and his voice had a calming, reassuring quality that immediately put me at ease. When I asked where he was going, he said simply that he was headed to the hospital in Walla Walla. This seemed like an incredible coincidence, and I told him about my father's condition and my desperate race to reach him before it was too late. The man listened sympathetically and said that he understood what I was going through. He mentioned that he had lost his own father many years ago and that he regretted not being able to spend more time with him before he died. As we continued toward Walla Walla, the man began sharing stories about his relationship with his father and the lessons he had learned about the importance of family. He spoke about how work and career ambitions can distract us from the people who matter most, and how we often do not realize what we have lost until it is too late. His words hit me hard because they perfectly described my own situation with my father. The man also talked about the process of dying and what it means to let go of someone you love. He said that death is not always the enemy we think it is, and that sometimes the kindest thing we can do for someone who is suffering is to give them permission to go peacefully. He spoke about the importance of forgiveness, both asking for it and offering it, and how unresolved conflicts can haunt us long after someone has passed away. I found myself opening up to this stranger in ways that I had never done before. I told him about my complicated relationship with my father, how we had argued about his stubborn independence and his refusal to take care of his health. I confessed that I had been angry with him for years about his drinking and his unwillingness to change his lifestyle, and that I was afraid he would die before we could resolve our differences. The man listened without judgment and offered gentle guidance about how to approach the difficult conversation I would need to have with my father. He suggested that I focus on expressing my love and gratitude rather than dwelling on our past conflicts. He said that dying people need to hear that they are loved and that their lives have had meaning, and that everything else is secondary to those fundamental truths. As we got closer to Walla Walla, the man's presence became even more comforting. The snow was falling more heavily now, making driving conditions treacherous, but I felt calm and focused in a way that I had not experienced in years. The man seemed to radiate a sense of peace and wisdom that helped me prepare mentally for what I might find at the hospital. When we reached the outskirts of Walla Walla, I asked the man where exactly at the hospital he needed to be dropped off. He smiled and said that he would know when we got there. As we pulled into the hospital parking lot, I looked for a place to stop near the main entrance. When I found a parking space and turned to ask the man if this location would work for him, he was gone. The passenger seat was empty, and there was no sign that anyone had been sitting there. The seatbelt was still buckled, and there was a faint warmth where he had been sitting, but the man had simply vanished. I checked the back seat and looked around the parking lot, but there was no trace of him anywhere. He had disappeared as mysteriously as he had appeared on the highway outside of town. I sat in my car for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened. Had I been so stressed and exhausted that I had imagined the entire conversation? But the man's words were still fresh in my mind, and I could still remember the details of his face and voice. The experience had felt completely real, and his advice about how to talk to my father seemed too specific and helpful to have been a product of my own subconscious mind. I eventually went inside the hospital and found my way to the cardiac intensive care unit. My father was alive, but barely. He was unconscious and connected to multiple machines that were monitoring his vital signs. The doctor told me that he had suffered massive damage to his heart and that his prognosis was very poor. They did not expect him to survive more than a few hours, and they recommended that I prepare myself for the worst. I spent the next 2 hours sitting beside my father's bed, holding his hand and following the advice that the mysterious passenger had given me. Instead of dwelling on our past conflicts, I focused on telling him how much I loved him and how grateful I was for everything he had done for me throughout my life. I talked about my favorite memories of our time together and assured him that it was okay for him to let go if he was ready. Around 4 a.m., my father's eyes opened briefly and he looked directly at me. He could not speak because of the breathing tube, but I could see recognition in his eyes and what looked like gratitude. He squeezed my hand weakly, and I told him again that I loved him and that he had been a good father. A few minutes later, his heart stopped, and he died peacefully with me holding his hand. The funeral was held 3 days later, and many of my father's friends and neighbors came to pay their respects. After the service, an elderly man approached me and said that he had known my father for many years. He mentioned that my father had often talked about me and how proud he was of my career success, but that he had always worried that I was too focused on work to be happy. The man also told me something that made my blood run cold. He said that about 5 years earlier, my father had been driving to the hospital late at night to visit a friend who was dying. On the way there, he had picked up a stranded motorist and given him a ride. The passenger had been a kind man who had helped my father process his feelings about death and loss, and the conversation had been so meaningful that my father had talked about it for years afterward. According to this family friend, my father had always said that he believed the passenger had been some kind of angel or spirit who had been sent to help him through a difficult time. My father had described the man as being in his 50s, with graying hair and a gentle voice, wearing clothes that seemed out of date. The description matched exactly the passenger I had encountered on my own desperate drive to the hospital. I've never been able to explain what happened that night on Highway 12. I do not know who the man was or how he disappeared from my car without a trace, but I believe that he was somehow connected to my father, perhaps sent to help me through the same kind of crisis that my father had faced years earlier. The advice he gave me was exactly what I needed to hear, and it allowed me to have the kind of final conversation with my father that brought both of us peace. The experience has changed my perspective on life and death in profound ways. I have learned to prioritize my relationships over my career ambitions, and I make time for the people who matter most to me. I also no longer fear death the way I used to, because I have seen evidence that there are forces beyond our understanding that help us through life's most difficult transitions. I still drive Highway 12 occasionally when I visit my father's grave in Walla Walla, but I have never seen the mysterious passenger again. However, I always watch for stranded motorists, and I have stopped to help several people over the past year. Each time I offer assistance to someone in need, I remember my father's passenger and the kindness he showed to both of us when we needed it most. Perhaps that is how these acts of compassion work, creating a chain of kindness that continues long after the original participants have moved on to whatever comes next.